When I came in this morning, I had several people make comments about the highly controversial nature of my sermon today. If you don't know what it is, it's about responding to Nazis, the KKK, and white supremacists. I didn't think that was going to provoke such concern on the part of so many of you. You would think this one's a slam dunk, easy one to do, right? Except you also know that I'm always going to give you some things to think about that perhaps you hadn't thought about. We're going to start by talking a little bit about what white supremacy is. Let's be frank and blunt about this. White supremacy is the notion that the white race is superior. Not just that it's somewhat better, but that it is vastly superior. White supremacy teaches that a society, a group, a congregation, a nation is better if it's all white. That if all the other races are removed, you will soar to new heights. In fact, these other races are often viewed as infections, or at the very best, just lesser forms of what humans could be. And white supremacists believe wholeheartedly that there is something vastly superior about being white. And we're not going to water this definition down. I've spoken about this in the past, earlier this year in fact, when it became a thing within the UU world to redefine the word white supremacy, to include all the horrible things that white people do, the advantages we have, the inconsiderate way we act towards other races, and call all of this white supremacy. And if you read Unitarian Universalist articles or websites or anything, you will not go far before you see something about removing white supremacy culture from UU congregations. I disagree strongly with that definition of white supremacy. That doesn't mean that there isn't tons of work to be done. But as I've said, there is something called white supremacists. And they believe what I just told you. And I do not believe UU congregations are filled with people who think the white race is vastly superior to others. They may act like jerks. They may be inconsiderate. They may not acknowledge the privilege they get. This is all true. Absolutely true. But white supremacy is a thing. It's in our midst. And if you call everything white supremacy, nothing is white supremacy. And so I can stand up and say that because no one can come fire me from headquarters. No one can kick me out of the UU Minister Association. I feel very strongly about this, and I may be the only one. And you may disagree strongly with me, and that's fine. We'll talk about it the second hour. But with that understanding, we are now going to look at what it means for us when we are confronted with white supremacy. And I may use the term Nazi or KKK in this sermon, and while they all practice and believe white supremacy, there are some differences also. Nazis were National Socialists. It was a political movement, but in Germany, they incorporated white supremacy into a political movement. Adolf Hitler preached the notion of the nation as a living organism, and all of the non-Aryan races were infections in that organism and needed to be removed in order for the organism of Germany to be healthy. That is a political movement that totally and completely embraced white supremacy, and we've seen the results. So if I say Nazi or KKK or white supremacist, they all believe in white supremacy, but I also understand the differences, and we can talk about that also later. I'm going to begin by reading a portion of an article by Carol Markowitz, September 24th, 2017, from the New York Post. Last week, a man was spotted wearing a red swastika armband while riding on a Seattle city bus. A bystander took his photograph and posted it online, along with his location. This mobilized Antifa, which is an organization that stands for anti-fascist, and is filled largely with anarchists and communists and other people who just hate white supremacists and will use violence against them. We'll talk more about them later. This mobilized Antifa to find the man and confront him, resulting in his being punched in the face and knocked out cold. A video of this interaction went viral, and predictably the internet cheered. And this was just the latest in a series of videos over the last few months of white supremacists getting punched in the face, to the joy of the watching public. Indeed, this kind of thing is happening so often that the phrase punching Nazis is now part of our lexicon. Yet unfortunately, what's actually happening is speech is being shut down with violence, threatening a fundamental American right. Sure, this speech might be vile and hateful, but it's still just speech. So that's the end of the quote. How should we, you and I, react to Nazis, the KKK, white supremacists? This is not just an academic question. It's not just something I came up with for a sermon, because we actually had to deal with it very recently. In October, a white supremacist rally was held one town over in Shelbyville, or Shebville, depending on how you say it. Shelbyville. The question came up in several discussions that I had with people prior to this rally about whether or not they should attend as a counter-protester. And I'm going to talk about my views on that. And again, you can disagree with me. You may disagree with me. You may think I'm completely out in left field. That's fine, because I don't claim to have all the answers, but here's how I view it. And it might give you some things to think about as you determine your steps, because I'm sure this won't be the last time we get to deal with this idiocy of white supremacists rallying. First of all, as I need to emphasize again and again, white supremacy refers to a group of people who really believe the white race is superior. And that is the sort of stuff that gets preached at these rallies. Redefining the term, again, I caution everybody, makes it meaningless and detracts from the true poisonous venom of white supremacists. That there are people who really do long for the good old days of Adolf Hitler, where they really were shipping people off to camps and killing them. We don't water that down. Number two, white supremacy is a vile doctrine. Nothing I say about freedom of speech in this sermon should be taken any other way. It is stupid. It is idiotic. You can call it any name you want. But their ideology is also covered by our protections of freedom of speech and freedom of assembly. You may hate it, but it's a freedom we should cherish in this country. Sometimes freedoms go to people we don't agree with. That's fine. The freedom applies to us also. If you think about where we're located as a congregation and the sort of things you hear from this pulpit, the sort of things that get put out on our website, because all our sermons get out there, there are tons of people around here who hate what we proclaim. They really do. But they don't shut us down through violence. And we have the freedom to assemble and to say things that are a minority view in this community. Be thankful for those freedoms. White supremacy is not a powerful movement in our country. People love to say we're back to the days of Nazi Germany. No, we're not. Not even close. If you're not aware of the history, after World War I, Germany was impoverished, and they could look east and see what happened to Russia. The communist revolution occurred, and they could see communism spreading, and they were scared to death of it. And the group that rose to oppose the communists were the Nazis. And that's why the Nazis not only became powerful, they had private armies to fight in the streets and attack businesses and brutalize people that they disagreed with. And literally, communists and Nazis were fighting in the streets. which is exactly what is happening on a much smaller scale when Antifa fights white supremacists in our country. It's on a much smaller scale. So it's interesting that people will say, see, it's happening again. Sort of. Kind of. Yes, you have two groups that hate each other, and they are fighting in the streets. But it's not the scale of what was going on in Nazi Germany. Not even close. And if you want to see how our checks and balances in our government work, just remember that if the president had absolute power, right now, news organizations would be shut down left and right, because that's exactly what Donald Trump says he wants to do. But he can't do it, because we have freedom of speech. We have checks and balances in our government, and the Nazis aren't rising to power. Trump doesn't have a private army fighting in the streets with the private Democratic army. And people are wondering if their business is the next one that's going to get firebombed. Different world. And so we have to be careful not to blow this up into something it's not. What they preach is horrible. Again and again, I will emphasize that. But it's not on the scale of what happened in Germany. And when people say that, they demean what happened in Germany and show a lack of historical understanding. So please avoid those sorts of exaggerations. Furthermore, since the Nazis in this country are really very small in number compared to the population of our country, they want attention. They want publicity. They want you to punch them in the face, because that gets on videos. And who looks like the good guy? The poor Nazi who's simply trying to exercise free speech, and a thug runs up and punches him in the face. Don't be on the side of the thug. No matter how much you hate the Nazi, violence overthrowing free speech should scare you. It should terrify you, because one day it could be you. So don't side with the thugs, no matter how much you hate what the white supremacists say. They love to be portrayed as the victims. So counter-protests of any sort have to be nonviolent. Number one, have to be nonviolent. No matter how much you hate what they say, do not counter with violence, or you make them the heroes. The best thing, in my humble opinion, you can do when a small group of people filled with hate meet in Shelbyville is ignore them. Let the police keep them under control and ignore them. Don't give them publicity. And I'll tell you some reasons why I think that is the case. But the worst thing you can do is counter with violence. If you actually think violence is warranted, then you better be actually ready to fight a war. I mean, a literal war. Because that's where violence ends up. And it did happen. We fought a war against the Nazis. We fought wars against the communists. My father fought a war against communists. I don't get real excited when liberals are marching in front of people with a red flag with a hammer and sickle on it. That's as abhorrent to me as the Nazi flag. To see a swastika. If you don't know about the atrocities committed by communist regimes, do a little research. Check out what the Soviet Union, Maoist China, Cambodia did to their people. You know, the Nazis got nothing on them. You go by sheer numbers, it will blow your mind. So don't ally with either group. Don't sympathize with either group. Their history is one of violence. And don't fall into the trap of wanting to use violence against them unless you really are ready to go to war. Another common tactic used in these counter-protests is to drown out speeches with noise. This, to some degree, happened in Shelbyville. It's certainly common on college campuses. a group of students decide they don't like what someone's going to say, and they just make noise until they can't give their speech. This is just another form of violence. It may not be physical violence, but it's thuggery, because you're saying, through my exercise of force, I will stop you from exercising your right. And I think I'm right. I'm on the side of good. So I'm going to drown you out with music or bullhorns or noisemakers or whatever it is, because I've decided you don't have a right to speak. That should terrify you. Yes. That's going on campuses right now. Yes. Beware when free speech is attacked. It doesn't matter what they're saying. It doesn't matter if it's horrible. Our country was founded on this principle that we don't have governmental organizations that go around and shut you down if they don't like what you say. And if you advocate for government controls on hate speech, just think about who you would be turning that power over to right now. Do you really want the Trump administration deciding what you can and can't say? Do you want a government police organization for pure thought checking out our sermons and deciding, oh, we're not conservative enough, you're a threat to the country, you can't speak anymore? Is that the world you want to live in? Or do you want to live in the world where we're free, but the Nazis get to give their little speeches too? I'll take that over government control of our freedoms any day. Furthermore, you want to talk about hate speech. Just remember the history of the Universalists and the Unitarians. The Universalists formed as a protest and a counter to the worst hate speech in all of human history. And that hate speech is, each one of you deserves eternal damnation. And only by the grace of God will some of you escape it. And the rest of you literally deserve to be tortured for all eternity. And the Universalists said, no, that's irrational, it's illogical. A God of love doesn't torture people. How can you believe that? And for a long time, they were a hated minority. That's the history of this church. And right now, in our community, we have churches that still preach hate speech well beyond white supremacy, that every human being deserves eternal damnation. And then you have to follow one path or another to escape it. Well, if Doug were king, Doug would say, that's horrible, horrible hate speech. We should shut that down. How terrible that people would proclaim that hatred and proclaim it to their children. We have to protect people from this. Except, then Doug would think, you know what? Freedom of speech. Even though I think it's horrible, and it is horrible, because I used to do it. I used to teach kids. I used to teach them how to escape the eternal damnation they deserve. That speech does damage. It hurts people. It divides families. But you know what? It's protected speech. And I just have to step back and say, that's the way it is in this country, and I'm not going to try to stop them. Nor should I try to stop them. Nor would I if I had the power. Because freedom of speech is something we should hold dear. In any form of counter-protest, you must also give careful consideration to what you are trying to achieve. What are your actual goals as you head out there to counter-protest? Are you going to try to convert the Nazis and the KKK and the white supremacists? Will your sign, will your singing, will your noise-making, will your sheer numbers convert any of them? Probably not. So that's probably not why you're going. If that is your goal, you're probably going to fail. What else might you be trying to do? Are you trying to prevent them from speaking? Some people were. Through noise, if not violence, through harassment, through other means, to keep them from having their legal constitutionally protected rally? You're going to use violence and noise to stop that? That's not your right. No matter how repugnant their message, we don't have the right to do that. Are you trying to punch a Nazi, hoping to get in a free shot? I've already talked about the violence. Violence begets violence. You don't throw a punch unless you're ready to fight a full-scale war. You just don't use violence. Not to mention the fact you're going to make them the hero and you're the villain. Are you trying to win the media war, show that there's more of you than them? Possibly. It's good a photo op opportunity, but does anyone around here really think that the Nazis are the majority? Or that the white supremacists are the majority? That most people agree with them? Do we need a photo op to prove that point? We can debate that one. That one at least makes some sense. Have this huge photo of a counter rally, except most people know that's the case. And is it worth the risk of the violence? Because if you know Antifa is showing up, you know there's going to be a risk of violence because they advocate the use of violence. And do you want to be a part of that? Do you want to be in a photograph with people marching with the hammer and sickle behind you? Are those your brothers and sisters? Do you really find yourself in common cause with communists? Just because you both hate Nazis? Don't know that that's the photo op I want. One good option is what they did in Murfreesboro. You have counter assemblies, but not physically located with the Nazis and the KKK. You do it in other places, and you promote love and unity and diversity. But you're not there yelling and screaming at the Nazis. You're doing something else somewhere else and drawing large crowds to do it. That covers your photo op opportunity. That covers the protection of all of you from the violence that Antifa wants to perpetrate. It does send a message without putting your lives at risk. And it does allow the Nazis and the KKK to have their rights protected also. So those are my thoughts. As I said, you don't have to agree with any of them. But this is sort of how my mind works, is people were asking me, should I go to this counter-protest or not? Dan Carlin, who's a podcaster, who hosts a couple of podcasts that I love to listen to, Hardcore History and Common Sense, tells a story in his most recent podcast. He's very depressed about the divisiveness right now in our country. It's to the point that he says, my podcast, Common Sense, doesn't apply anymore. There is no more common sense. We hate each other like we've never hated each other before. He said, I've tried to do this podcast 12 times. I couldn't get through it because I just don't know what to say anymore. And he tells a story that he has many times said, don't use violence against the Nazis. Don't punch a Nazi in the face. And one of his listeners wanted to correct him and help him to see things clearly. This person was a counter-protester at many of these events, and this person suggested that the government should put limits on free speech, like Nazis, white supremacists. Dan says, isn't this ironic? This guy marches with people flying the hammer and sickle. In the 50s and 60s, the Nazis were an absolute joke in America, but the communists were scary. You remember the Red Scare, those of you who were older, and even if you're younger, your history books hopefully talked about this. The government watched anyone with communist ties, and they restricted what they could do, and people lost jobs and got blackballed because of it. Freedom of speech was not upheld. And now the people who were the victims of this very government regulation are saying, limit the free speech of the white supremacist, forgetting that that's exactly what was done to them. You don't want the government limiting your free speech. As for using violence, Dan says, If you punch a Nazi, they ain't any less a Nazi than before you punched them. In fact, you may have hardened their positions, and you may have lost the crowd. The only chance we have here is not killing them, it's conversion. And after that, I'm going to quote Sam Harris, a simple line. I love listening to Sam Harris. He's a philosopher, amongst other things. The way to defeat bad ideas is with good ideas. Think about that. The way to defeat bad ideas is with good ideas. He too says, don't use violence. Don't punch a Nazi in the face. Get the good ideas out there. Share the good ideas. You can't do this if you're not having a conversation. And right now it's very hard to have conversations in this country. Dan Carlin cautioned that our society was becoming so fractious, we may never recover. The only way to hold our country together is to start listening to each other. Even if you find that unpleasant and repugnant, have a real conversation with someone on the other side. And I'm not just referring to Nazis and white supremacists. I'm talking about whatever your political orientation, listen to the people on the other side. Find out where they're coming from. Talk and listen. You don't have to agree, but you can certainly offer counter arguments. But this is not what we're seeing right now when people's free speech is being shut down through thuggish actions, through noise and protests, where college campuses, which of all places should be places of free speech, people are constantly getting shouted down, shut down, and forced to give up when they've been invited to speak. This is despicable behavior. I will not sugarcoat it. It is despicable behavior. It is bullying. It is saying, I have the power and the force and the violence that I can stop you from speaking. Do not ally yourself in your mind or your heart with people who shut down free speech, no matter how much you hate the speech. If you haven't noticed, that is sort of the theme of the message today. Please take that away, if nothing else. We do not want to live in a world where a group of thugs decide who gets to speak. I'm going to close with another quote by Carol Markowitz. She's the one who wrote the article at the very beginning that I read. I am a Jew of Eastern European descent. Actual Nazis are responsible for the displacement and annihilation of part of my family. During the free speech of their modern-day counterparts who march through the streets of Charlottesville chanting, Jews will not replace us, defending that speech is hard but necessary. But, truth is, these creeps actually need to be protected if we are to preserve a bedrock right that helps guarantee the essence and future of this country. The irony is that white supremacists are eager to erode our freedoms and our proud American character. But why cheer for thugs like Antifa who help them do that? Do not be part of the group in any way, shape, or form, even with your emotional support or consent. Do not be part of any movement that deprives us of our freedom of speech. Thank you.